Chancellorsville had been Robert E. Lee's masterstroke, but heavy casualties and the death of Stonewall Jackson reduced a great victory into a Pyrrhic one. Worse, his supply situation was collapsing, and he was under pressure to help the deteriorating situation out west. It was clear that the Confederacy was losing the war. Thus, Lee concluded that another northern invasion was the South's best and perhaps final chance to win the war. This decision would embark the Confederacy's most iconic general on a path towards perhaps the most iconic engagement ever fought on American soil, the Battle of Gettysburg. Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. Joseph Hooker's Army of the Potomac returned to its encampments near Fredericksburg by May 10th, and the Army of Northern Virginia reoccupied their fortifications almost as if Chancellorsville hadn't happened. Both armies required rest, reorganization, and replenishment, but only one would finish rebuilding before the next campaign began. Even before Chancellorsville, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck had hated Hooker's haughty personality and wanted him replaced. However, Hooker's dispatches let him shift the blame for the defeat. Both John Sedgwick and George Stoneman had clearly failed to carry out their orders, for which Stoneman was dismissed from cavalry command, while the 11th Corps commander, O.O. Howard, hadn't heeded Hooker's warning about Jackson's flank attack. President Lincoln acknowledged that Hooker's subordinates had failed him and allowed him to retain command. In exchange, Lincoln demanded Hooker attack again, which he refused. The Army of the Potomac was normally 120,000 men strong, but only had 75,000 ready for duty. It suffered 20,000 casualties during the Chancellorsville campaign, and 35,000 enlistments had expired, with the troops returning home. At the current replenishment rate, it would only be back to 90,000 by June. Recruiting was done by the states, and many were having trouble filling their quotas. Generous monetary bonuses kept the volunteers coming, with additional incentives offered to re-enlist veterans, but they weren't coming fast enough. Many states resorted to calling up militia regiments, but they only served for a few months before heading home. In response, Lincoln authorized the recruitment of African American soldiers, starting with the 54th Massachusetts, and Congress enabled states to begin drafting soldiers via the Enrollment Act. However, these were long-term solutions, and in the short term, Hooker's army would remain under strength. Meanwhile, Lee was conflicted. On the one hand, Chancellorsville had convinced him that his army was invincible. On the other, the Confederacy was in crisis. While both sides' draft laws allowed men to hire substitutes or pay to avoid serving, the Confederacy included numerous exemptions for the planter class. Consequently, the already limited food supply collapsed as poor farmers were hauled off to fight. Their wives were now leading bread riots across southern cities, and desertion was rising. The non-slaveholding majority were questioning fighting for the privileged few's interests when they wouldn't fight themselves. Worse, the Western theater was collapsing. Ulysses S. Grant had crossed the Mississippi and was bearing down on Vicksburg, while Nathaniel Banks marched on Port Hudson. If either fortress fell, the Red and Mississippi rivers would be lost, and with them, Texas's critical supplies of horses and beef. Joseph Johnston and Jefferson Davis thus asked Lee to send reinforcements west to save the situation. Lee refused as he didn't believe he could intervene in time. The Yankees only needed to take one fortress to close both rivers to the Confederacy. The limited Confederate rail network was already severely overtaxed, and the most direct route to Mississippi was exposed to Federal raids. Reinforcements had to travel a more circuitous route, followed by a long march to reach either city, almost certainly arriving too late. Instead, Lee would reinvade the North. An invasion might draw away Federal troops from Mississippi, and more pressingly, looting northern supplies was the only option to feed his army. there was nothing left in the South. Additionally, moving the war out of Virginia for the summer would allow the farmers to get a crop sown and harvested, alleviating the food problem. It would also provide some time to fix damaged infrastructure. Moreover, Lee was convinced that an invasion of the North was a war-winning strategy. Lord Palmerston was still open to recognizing the Confederacy, but he needed a decisive victory to overcome British public opinion. Additionally, Lee believed that Northern morale was nearing collapse. Both sides read the other's newspapers, but for unknown reasons, Lee only received anti-war Copperhead papers, which wildly exaggerated Northern war weariness, material shortages, and desire for peace. Consequently, Lee incorrectly believed that the Union war effort was as close to collapse as the Confederacy's. Therefore, a victory on Northern soil would finally win international recognition and force the war to end. First, Lee had to reorganize his army. New conscripts brought his strength up to 75,000, but Stonewall Jackson was irreplaceable, and his command had to be split into two new corps. Jackson's subordinates, Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill, would command the 2nd and new 3rd Corps respectively, alongside James Longstreet's 1st Corps. Unfortunately, both men were used to Jackson's highly detailed and specific orders, and struggled to adjust to Lee's vague directives. Worse, Lee didn't actually speak English, but a dialect called Southern Gentleman, which replaced entire paragraphs of dialogue with meaningful pauses, glances, and aristocratic bearing. Longstreet and Jackson understood this dialect, and heard the details and intentions Lee left unsaid, but Hill and Ewell didn't. Consequently, they frequently misunderstood Lee's orders. Lee had to reach Pennsylvania this time, so he planned to move faster and in greater secrecy than during the Maryland campaign. The army would quietly slip away from Fredericksburg before clearing and then moving up the Shenandoah Valley to hide the march. From there, they would spread out into Pennsylvania, acquiring supplies. Once the Union Army engaged, his forces would rapidly reconcentrate to win the decisive battle. Ewell began slipping away on June 3rd. The next day, Federal sentries reported movement in the rebel camp. Hooker cancelled everyone's leave and ordered the army to prepare for action on June 5th. Sedgwick launched a reconnaissance in force that night, which found weakened but still formidable Confederate defenses, and withdrew with prisoners for the Bureau of Military Information. Their interrogation yielded little intelligence beyond confirming parts of the army were moving. On June 6th, John Buford reported Confederate cavalry in Culpeper County. The BMI confirmed that J.E.B. Stuart was concentrating his forces, while Lee appeared to be moving southwest toward Richmond. Fearing a major raid, Hooker dispatched the Cavalry Corps, now under Alfred Pleasonton, and riding in two wings with infantry support to confront Stuart. At 04:30 on June 9th, Buford crossed the Rappahannock at Beverly's Ford, surprising and scattering rebel vedettes in the dense fog. He'd stumbled onto Stuart's camp, which was alerted by the gunfire. The nearest brigade lurched out of bed onto unsaddled horses to engage, delaying Buford long enough for Stuart's horse artillery to position itself on knolls and open fire. As the Confederates began drawing up around the guns, the 6th Pennsylvania charged them near St. James Church, only to be driven off with heavy casualties. Buford's men dismounted and attempted to turn the Confederate flank with carbine fire, only for the rebels to unexpectedly withdraw. Gregg's division had arrived from Kelly's Ford, threatening the rebel flank on Fleetwood Hill. Stuart hurriedly redeployed, moved in reinforcements, and repelled Gregg's attack. A cycle of charges and countercharges, supported by artillery, ensued until the Federals withdrew near sunset. While tactically a Confederate victory, Brandy Station was the first time Federal cavalry had matched the Confederates in skill and determination. This disturbed Stuart, as his troopers' elan was their only advantage. Previously, the Federals had only won cavalry engagements through overwhelming numbers or surprise. Seeing them finally match the Confederates' skill destroyed his men's confidence, which Stuart would do anything to revive. With more reports coming in of Confederates moving west, Hooker proposed moving on Richmond's weakened defenses, but Lincoln refused. Instead, Hooker was ordered to find and destroy Lee's army. Lincoln was now convinced that Hooker taking Richmond was equivalent to Howe taking Philadelphia rather than Napoleon taking Vienna, and therefore strategically irrelevant. However, Hooker didn't know where Lee was, as Pleasonton couldn't get past Stuart. On June 14th, word reached Hooker that Ewell had attacked the Winchester garrison, who'd ignored warnings from Halleck to withdraw at the first sign of Confederates. Lee was clearly moving into the Shenandoah Valley, but his objective was still unknown. Still, he had to respond, and Hooker ordered the army to march for Manassas Junction, which held the crossroads to wherever Lee was heading. Stuart's cavalry screen continued blocking Pleasanton's attempts to uncover Lee's movements, and Ewell began crossing the Potomac near Williamsport on June 15th, deliberately avoiding Harper's Ferry garrison. Ewell quickly moved on to Hagerstown, while Longstreet and Hill crossed near Sharpsburg on the 17th, with all generals sending out foraging parties as they advanced. Lee gave strict orders not to loot, but to pay for all supplies with Confederate money or Army promissory notes, which were worthless and less than worthless respectively. Many Northerners complained that it felt worse than being robbed. Lee entered Pennsylvania on June 22nd, and the alarm was raised. Meanwhile, Hooker was still near Manassas Junction, uninformed about Lee's movements. Stuart had thwarted Pleasanton's latest attempts to find Lee the previous day, before disappearing himself. Hooker ordered Pleasanton to scour the countryside for rebels, while gradually shifting the army north as a precaution. Stuart received verbal orders from Lee on June 22nd to defend the right flank. However, Lee's vagueness gave Stuart enough interpretation room to go adventuring. To that end, he would reassert Confederate cavalry dominance and ride around the Army of the Potomac again to rebuild his troopers' confidence. Taking his best brigades while the rest screened Lee, Stuart departed on June 25th, intending to circle the Federal Army, frighten Washington, D.C., and then rejoin Lee before he was missed. However, word of Lee in Pennsylvania finally reached Hooker the same day, and he ordered his men north in earnest to catch Lee. While Stuart successfully made it around Hooker, capturing supplies and damaging infrastructure, he found his route back to Lee blocked by Union soldiers. Worse, Judson Kilpatrick's cavalry division, particularly George Custer's Michigan Brigade, caught his scent and pursued. Stuart realized that he'd have to ride far harder and further north than planned to regroup with Lee. The Army of the Potomac marched rapidly, with Buford in the lead, followed by John Reynolds' First Corps, with Frederick as the rendezvous point. Halleck tried to tempt Lee back to Virginia with a raid on Richmond's outskirts, but it wasn't threatening enough. Meanwhile, Hooker was fighting with Halleck about reinforcements, and impetuously wired Lincoln that if the Harper's Ferry garrison wasn't assigned to him, he'd immediately resign. Lincoln accepted on June 27th. The first choice to replace Hooker was Reynolds, widely regarded as the best general in the army. He declined, and at the recommendation of other senior generals, command passed to George Meade on June 28th as the army reached Frederick. While his men fearfully called him Old Snapping Turtle behind his back, Meade's troops had always fought better than other units. Everyone hoped that Meade could similarly motivate the army to defend his home state. That night, Longstreet's personal spy, Henry Harrison, warned him that the Federals were quickly closing. Longstreet rushed to inform Lee, who was furious that Stuart hadn't warned him. His army was spread from Chambersburg to the outskirts of Harrisburg, skirmishing with militia, holding towns to ransom, purchasing supplies, and kidnapping hundreds of free African Americans into slavery. He immediately issued orders to concentrate at Cashtown. Henry Heath's division from Hill's Corps was first to arrive on June 29th, but he heard that there were supplies, including shoes, in the nearby town of Gettysburg, the crossroad of every road in southern Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, Meade settled into command. On June 30th, he made headquarters in Taneytown, before issuing orders to advance towards Gettysburg, the natural place to concentrate an army. He also began preparing positions along Big Pipe Creek as a fallback position. Heath ordered Pettigrew's brigade to Gettysburg to investigate the supply rumors. As Pettigrew arrived, Buford arrived on high ground south of town. Pettigrew reported the Federals to Heath after finding nothing of value in Gettysburg. Both generals thought it was just militia, but a reconnaissance in force would be launched to be certain. Buford knew that infantry moving in enemy territory without cavalry screens meant the main body was close, and the high ground south of Gettysburg was a perfect defensive position. Knowing the hills must be denied to the rebels, Buford prepared a delaying action north of Gettysburg, then alerted Reynolds, who alerted Meade, before preparing a quick march to support Buford. At 07:30 on July 1st, Heath made first contact with Buford's vedettes astride Chambersburg Pike. Pushing through, Heath's infantry encountered Gamble's dismounted brigade in cover along Hur's Ridge. Despite being outnumbered 2,750 to 7,600, the troopers' breech-loading Sharps carbines allowed them to repel the initial probe through weight of fire. However, the rebels reformed and made a more determined push. By 10:20, Heath had pushed Gamble back to McPherson's Ridge, where Devin's brigade joined the fight. Heath still would have pushed through if not for Reynolds' timely arrival. As his men replaced Buford's exhausted troopers, Reynolds was killed by a random bullet, and Abner Doubleday took command. The Union right was pushed back before it got into position, but the left and centre held as the Iron Brigade's reserve regiment counterattacked along a railroad cut, routing a Confederate brigade. Fighting paused at 11:30. Lee'd given orders to avoid a general engagement before the army concentrated, but since Heath had accidentally caused one, the rest of Hill's corps moved to support him. Meanwhile, the 11th Corps arrived as Doubleday redeployed along McPherson's and Seminary Ridge. As the senior officer, Howard took command and requested all available reinforcements move swiftly to Gettysburg. He was about to face 2/3 of the Army of Northern Virginia alone. Ewell was obliviously approaching via the Carlisle and Harrisburg roads. He simply intended to use the crossroads to reach Cashtown, but he had no idea that the battle was joined until the Federal infantry blocked his way. With Lee's orders to avoid battle now moot, Ewell prepared to attack. Rhodes' division moved into position and attacked Oak Ridge at 1400. However, the lead brigade didn't do any reconnaissance before marching into the teeth of the defences, where they suffered devastating casualties. Lee arrived around 1430. Accepting that battle couldn't be avoided, he ordered all commands to attack. Hill's troops pushed the 1st Corps back to Seminary Ridge, with heavy casualties all around. Meanwhile, Early's division had arrived down the Harrisburg Road. The 11th Corps was overstretched, and its flank was exposed. Deploying his troops in a wider, deeper line than the entire Union position, Early first assaulted the salient on Barlow's Knoll, before shattering the 11th Corps' left flank, forcing it into a panicked retreat by 1600. Meanwhile, the 1st Corps artillery was devastating the continued Confederate attacks with concentrated double canister fire. However, as more Confederates arrived, the position became untenable, and the left was flanked by superior numbers. With the 11th Corps routing, the 1st Corps began retreating through Gettysburg at 1630. The defenders retreated to Cemetery and Culp's Hills, where the 2nd Corps' commander Winfield Scott had assumed command, placing his troops on Cemetery Ridge and the 12th Corps' vanguard on Culp's Hill. The survivors were ordered to occupy Cemetery Hill and start digging in. The high ground was to be held at all costs. Lee also realized the value of high ground. Accordingly, he ordered Ewell to carry the hill occupied by the enemy if he found it practicable, but to avoid a general engagement until the arrival of the other divisions of the army. Ewell looked at the steep slopes and deploying Federals, looked at his exhausted soldiers, and concluded an attack wasn't practicable. Lee meant, "Take that hill immediately, you won't be blamed for failure," but this was lost in translation from Southern gentleman to English. This critical decision dictated the rest of the Battle of Gettysburg. After dark, Hill and Ewell's corps finished arriving in Gettysburg alongside Longstreet's vanguard. During the Council of War, Lee lamented that Stuart's absence had left him without reconnaissance on Union strength and positions. Stuart had just gotten around Custer's pursuit near Carlisle that afternoon and was looking for Lee. Longstreet argued that the Federal position was too strong to attack. Instead, they should disengage and force Meade to attack them on favorable ground. However, all the other generals refused. Leaving the battlefield meant admitting defeat, which could shatter morale. Worse, Meade could ambush them on the road. They'd stay and fight tomorrow. Across the field, the 12th, 3rd and 5th Corps had all arrived, but the 6th Corps was still in Maryland and wouldn't start arriving until late tomorrow. Meade arrived after midnight. Unable to survey the battlefield, he asked Hancock about the position, who declared it the best natural defensive position in the world. The Army's chief engineer, Gouverneur Warren, agreed. The Army of the Potomac would make it stand along a fishhook of hills and ridges stretching from Culp's Hill to Little Round Top. At dawn on July 2nd, Lee assumed that the Army of the Potomac only occupied Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill, and Culp's Hill. Therefore, an echelon attack up Emmitsburg Road would roll up the unsupported Union flank. Lee ordered Longstreet to lead the attack, with Ewell redeploying from the left to right flank to support him. Hill was incapacitated by illness, and his corps depleted from the first day, so it would remain in reserve. Both generals objected. Ewell didn't want to abandon ground his men had died for, while Longstreet didn't want to attack at all. If he had to attack, then it had to wait. Only elements from 2 of his divisions had arrived, with the trailing brigades due early afternoon. So Lee compromised. Ewell would remain on the Union right, while Longstreet attacked the left once Hood and McLaws' divisions assembled. Across the field, Meade's dawn reconnaissance proved Hancock correct. The corps was deployed on high ground, with interlocking fields of fire, supported by interior lines hidden by the ridge. Wherever Lee attacked, he'd be met by at least 2 corps. If he started breaking through, Meade could rush reinforcements from anywhere to swiftly repel the attack. This deployment was ruined by Daniel Sickles. He resented Meade being promoted instead of himself. Moreover, he was deeply bitter about Hooker ordering him to abandon Hazel Grove during Chancellorsville, and that a peach orchard along the Emmitsburg Road sat on higher ground than he occupied. Determined to not only show up Meade, but prevent another Chancellorsville, he moved the 3rd Corps forward from Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top without orders, to positions along the Emmitsburg Road around noon. Meade didn't discover this insubordination until Sickles failed to arrive at the afternoon staff meeting. Finding him shortly after 1500, a furious Meade tore into Sickles for having moved into a salient outside artillery support, and committing himself to holding a line too long for a single corps. Worse, it was too late to correct the mistake, as Confederates were spotted preparing to attack. Instead, Meade wheeled off to prepare a relief force. Longstreet was finally ready to attack at 1600 after a long march to hide his movements, but was surprised by Sickles' advanced position. Hood argued for flanking Sickles and taking Little Round Top, but Longstreet said there wasn't time to redeploy before Lee's patience expired. After a 30-minute artillery barrage, Hood's attack began. Hood ordered his men to take the heights. However, he didn't specify which heights before being wounded by artillery fire. Consequently, the attack was uncoordinated. Some regiments began marching for the 3rd Corps' left flank, while others marched for Round Top. The 2nd US Sharpshooters initiated contact from the base of Round Top and a boulder field called Devil's Den, while the Confederates assaulted the entire line. The defenders repelled 2 assaults against both Devil's Den and nearby Rose Wood. However, Confederate numbers let them flank the defenses via Plum Run Valley. The fighting was so fierce that the valley was renamed the Valley of Death, and the field was named Slaughter Pen. However, the pressure was too great for the defenders, who began fleeing north. Meanwhile, a disaster was averted at Little Round Top. Sickles' advance had left only a signal corps post on the hill, whose barren top oversaw the entire battlefield. Meade dispatched Warren to evaluate the situation, and after reaching the summit, he saw the glint of bayonets heading his way. He immediately sent out riders to find troops to hold the hill. Strong Vincent's brigade from the 5th Corps was the first to respond, arriving just as the Confederates gave up chasing the sharpshooters up Round Top and moved to take the more strategic hill. Though exhausted, the Confederates still launched a powerful assault on Vincent's right, which was repulsed. The attack began shifting left, as the Confederates looked for the flank held by the 20th Maine. Knowing there was nothing to his left but a few sharpshooters, Colonel Chamberlain first stretched his line, then bent it 90 degrees, holding off multiple attacks from 3 regiments who kept trying to flank him. Upon running out of ammunition, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge, his bent left swinging down like a door. The Confederates routed, and many were captured. However, the right flank nearly broke under heavy pressure, and Vincent was mortally wounded. Reinforcements ultimately drove off the rebels around 1800. Across the field, McLaws finally attacked at 1700. Moving in echelon formation, McLaws continued Hood's attack on Rose Wood, finally breaking through the defenses and extending to the Peach Orchard. The hard-pressed 3rd Corps fought fanatically, but were overwhelmed and began breaking. Sickles' right leg was shattered by cannon fire and later amputated. However, as the Confederate right broke through Stony Ridge and entered the wheat field, Federal reinforcements arrived. Meade had redeployed to the 5th Corps, along with 1 division from the 2nd Corps and 2 from the 12th Corps, to rescue the 3rd. The counterattack pushed McLaws out of the wheat field. Once his left flank finished breaking the Peach Orchard line after sustaining heavy casualties, McLaws again attacked and retook the wheat field. A flanking assault from Little Round Top pushed him out again as casualties piled up in the Valley of Death. The wheat field would change hands twice more before the Confederates conceded the fight at 2000. Further up the line, Lee added Hill's freshest division to the assault. Anderson's division struck the remaining 3rd Corps division holding the Peach Orchard line, crushing it and ending the 3rd Corps as a fighting unit. Anderson and McLaws continued the assault towards Cemetery Ridge, where gaps had been left after defenders redeployed to the wheat field. Fortunately, the long march left the rebels disorganized and required them to pause at Plum Run, giving Hancock and Meade time to find reinforcements. The first counterattack came from Willard's brigade against McLaws's right, shattering Barksdale's brigade and mortally wounding the general. Wilcox's brigade would have pushed through a gap, but for the 1st Minnesota launching a suicidal bayonet charge, which succeeded in halting Wilcox at the cost of all but 47 of the regiment's men. Several units claimed to make the crest of the hill before being thrown off by counterattacks, and the rebels pulled back by 1900. There is confusion among modern historians about what Ewell was supposed to be doing during Longstreet's assault. Lee later claimed that Ewell was supposed to demonstrate and then attack once he heard Longstreet's cannon fire. Ewell responded that he was only supposed to attack if a suitable opportunity appeared, and never heard Longstreet's guns anyway. Regardless, he had been ineffectively probing and bombarding Union positions on Cemetery and Culp's Hill since 1600. Around 1800, his troops discovered the defences had been weakened to defend the left flank, and Ewell ordered a general attack at 1900. Despite being lightly held, the Federal breastworks were formidable and backed with artillery. The attack on Culp's Hill captured abandoned rifle pits on the slope, but halted as darkness arrived. Early pushed through a gap, making it to the Baltimore Pike on East Cemetery Hill before incoming Federal reinforcements and nightfall forced him to retreat. Fighting on Culp's Hill continued, as some returning units stumbled on the rebels in the dark, while others intentionally launched night attacks. The guns finally fell silent about 22:30. Stuart finally shook his pursuers and rejoined Lee that afternoon. After being thoroughly dressed down for leaving the army blind, he was ordered to support Ewell, who was to bring up more troops and renew the attack on the heights the next day. Longstreet continued arguing to disengage, but Lee wouldn't hear it. Pickett's division had finally arrived, so a full-strength Longstreet was to attack again at dawn, simultaneously with Ewell. Meanwhile, Meade's War Council advised staying put. Their defences had been held, and the 6th Corps' arrival closed any holes remaining after the day's battles. The 12th Corps returned to Culp's Hill to drive off the rebels, and Meade warned the 2nd Corps to dig in, particularly Gibbon's division. Lee had attacked both flanks today, and if he was following Napoleonic doctrine, Gibbon's position at the exact centre would be next. The BMI now had prisoners from every Confederate unit but Pickett's division. Whatever happened next would be led by him. Despite Lee's intentions, Pickett's division wasn't on the battlefield ready to attack when dawn broke. Worse, at dawn, the 12th Corps' artillery opened up in preparation for retaking the hill. The bombardment prompted the Confederates to attack first. Lee tried to cancel the attack to preserve his plan, but Ewell tersely responded, too late to recall. Ewell's attempts to further reinforce the hill were halted by artillery fire from Cemetery Hill, and 3 waves of attacks failed against Union breastworks. Ewell ordered a retreat around 1100. Therefore, Lee changed his plan. The Federals had to be close to breaking after 2 days of hammering from his invincible army. They were pouring reinforcements onto Culp's Hill to drive off Ewell. His subordinates had reported making it to the top of the ridge yesterday. He had George Pickett's fresh, all-Virginian division ready. If he sent a purposeful attack at the depleted center, it would surely shatter, especially if spearheaded by Virginians, led by Longstreet, his warhorse. Lee's plan was characteristically audacious. Longstreet's corps would assemble with Pickett in the lead behind Seminary Ridge, while Stuart moved around the Union right flank. Following a mass artillery barrage, Both would charge the Union center somewhere near where Cemetery Hill became Cemetery Ridge, splitting the army in half. Longstreet was stunned, horrified, and strongly objected. McLaws and Hood's divisions were spent and too far south to get into position to attack. Even if they could, he didn't believe that Lee's plan could be achieved by less than 30,000 troops, and begged Lee to reconsider. Lee was adamant about attacking with Longstreet's 15,000, but agreed not to make McLaws and Hood redeploy. Instead, 2 divisions from Hill's corps were added to the attack force, which Pickett would lead under Longstreet's reluctant command. Stuart was informed of his role in the attack around 1000 and began moving once he was certain Ewell was retreating. At 1100, he crossed Cress's Ridge and signaled Lee by firing 4 cannons. This was a mistake. Union cavalry had been watching for Stuart to attempt a flanking move, and upon hearing the cannons, they moved to investigate. Skirmishers from McIntosh's brigade made first contact, stalling Stuart. A Confederate charge at 1300 scattered the skirmishers after Union artillery knocked out Stuart's guns. As the Confederates rode forward, a cry rang out, "Come on, you Wolverines!" Custer personally led the 7th Michigan to charge Stuart's lead brigade, breaking it after a fierce melee. Stuart prepared another charge, but Custer again roared, "Come on, you Wolverines!" and led the 1st Michigan in a countercharge. Stuart realized that his mission had failed. Even if he could push through, he'd never make it to the Union rear in time. Therefore, he withdrew. Lee intended to supplement Pickett with Hill's least engaged divisions. However, poor communication meant that Heath and Pender's heavily depleted divisions were assigned to the charge, despite the fact that both generals were incapacitated by wounds. It took all morning to assemble the 13,000 men and position every battery in the army for the bombardment. At 1300, the largest artillery barrage of the war began. Between 150 and 170 Confederate guns opened fire on Cemetery Ridge. A similar number of Union guns responded. The bombardment was completely ineffective. Most Confederate guns overshot, damaging Meade's headquarters, supply wagons, and the extensive reserve Meade had prepared, but missing the actual defenders. Union gunners couldn't effectively counter battery due to thick gun smoke and dense trees, but they weren't trying to. It was obvious an attack was coming, and they were saving ammunition to repel it. The Union guns purposefully slowed and then stopped firing one by one, tricking the Confederates into thinking they were silenced. Longstreet tried to get anyone else to order the attack, finally giving in and doing it himself at 1400 as Confederate gunners ran out of ammunition. The Confederates marched deliberately and steadily forward, with Trimble and Pettigrew on the left and Pickett on the right. Anderson's brigades failed to advance for reasons unknown. Federal guns immediately opened up. The 3 columns were supposed to gradually merge together for a concentrated strike, but the fields concealed uneven ground interspersed with fences, ruining cohesion. Worse, Federal artillery fire tore huge gaps in their lines. Union pickets in the fields opened fire, and then were bewildered as the Confederates marched past them. Orders were to not stop before reaching the ridge, but many soldiers dissented. Thousands hid in depressions in the fields and along the sunken Emmitsburg Road. Union defenders entrenched behind a series of stone walls, as the rebels were at Fredericksburg, and opened fire at 400 yards. As the column advanced and its line narrowed, Federal units advanced off the ridge to fire enfilade volleys. Pettigrew and Trimble faltered and stopped just past Emmitsburg Road. Anderson's brigades finally advanced, but artillery quickly turned them back. However, Pickett's division continued on towards a turn in the stone wall, and Alonzo Cushing's battery. Hancock was wounded as he directed fire on the column, and 2 of Pickett's brigade commanders fell. However, Lewis Armistead placed his hat atop his sword and led his men to charge the defences along the angle. Several Union regiments withdrew, letting Armistead and 250 men take Cushing's guns. However, additional regiments arrived and poured fire from 3 sides. No soldier who followed Armistead over the wall returned to Confederate lines. Pickett's charge cost 8,000 Confederate casualties to 1,500 Union, and ended at 1500 as survivors trickled back to Seminary Ridge. Thousands more would surrender once Union troops found their hiding places. Back on Seminary Ridge, Lee simply hung his head and said, "It's all my fault." He never explained his thinking beyond telling Jefferson Davis not to blame the soldiers for Lee asking too much of them. Pickett was distraught, openly blamed Lee for the disaster, and held the grudge for the rest of his life. His after-action report was so accusatory that Lee had it burned. However, morale remained high, and some units offered to reform and charge again, which Lee morosely refused. As Pickett's charge failed, Kilpatrick decided to diminish the victory. He'd been ordered to patrol the left flank and keep watch on Longstreet's corps. However, Kilpatrick wanted to fight and ordered reckless charges against the fortified infantry, which earned him the nickname Kill Cavalry. By 1700, all the guns fell silent. Battle of Gettysburg was the largest and deadliest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere, with over 150,000 men engaging during 3 days of battle. Meade reported 23,049 casualties, about 1/4 of his army. Lee's reports were increasingly terse and vague about casualties from this point onward. Historians agree he'd suffered between 23,000 to 28,000 casualties, over a third of his army. The North celebrated Meade's heroic victory. News that Vicksburg had fallen added to the euphoria. Over in Europe, Lord Palmerston quietly took recognition off the table. The Confederacy had no chance at outright victory now. Halleck and Lincoln congratulated Meade before ordering him to attack and destroy Lee. However, Meade's army was in worse condition than the casualty reports indicated. It had rapidly marched for a week and then spent 3 days fighting in a sweltering summer heatwave. The water sources that weren't fouled by blood were being drunk dry by the influx of 150,000 soldiers and at least that many animals to a township of 2,500. While no statistics were kept, war diaries and officers' reports suggest that half of each army became heat casualties at some point during the battle. Additionally, it was foolish to move off the heights to attack a still dangerous enemy. All the terrain advantages that won the battle would be reversed, and Meade refused to risk another Fredericksburg. Additionally, a torrential rainstorm arrived. Both armies spent a soggy Independence Day rescuing their wounded and exchanging prisoners. Lee knew his invasion had failed and began preparing to retreat during his nightly war council on July 3rd. Longstreet and Ewell pulled back to Seminary Ridge and built breastworks, anticipating that Meade would attack. When he didn't, Lee began slipping away on the night of July 4th, starting with the thousands of supply wagons taken during the invasion. Meade couldn't move his infantry until he knew what Lee was doing. To that end, the cavalry was dispatched on July 4th to harass Lee and report on his retreat. Pleasanton had some of his divisions skirmish with Stuart while dispatching others to watch the roads south. Kilpatrick partially redeemed himself by recapturing several hundred wagons in Monterey Pass the same day. Lee fully departed Gettysburg before dawn on July 5th, which Meade discovered mid-morning. However, he didn't know where Lee was heading and remained in place until July 7th, when the infantry moved south in 3 columns. Meanwhile, the cavalry continually clashed with Stuart and the Confederate rearguard, capturing thousands of prisoners. Lee was heading for the previously built pontoon bridges at Falling Waters between Hagerstown and Williamsport. However, the bridges were destroyed by high waters, worsened by heavy rains on July 7th, just as the army started arriving. Lee prepared fortifications to hold out until he could cross again. The defenses were finished just hours before Meade's infantry began arriving on July 12th. Seeing the extensive fortifications and still haunted by Fredericksburg, Meade refused to attack without proper artillery preparation. He positioned his army for a July 14th attack when the artillery was ready. Lee was counting on Meade recklessly attacking him, which Halleck and Lincoln were screaming at him to do. Realizing that he was instead preparing to bombard him into surrender, Lee ordered his engineers to get a bridge up now. This was done by nightfall July 13th, with water levels falling enough to ford as well. By morning, Lee was across the Potomac, though Meade continued pursuing him until the inconclusive Battle of Manassas Gap on July 23rd. Lincoln was deeply frustrated, but historians debate whether a more aggressive pursuit would have destroyed Lee or Meade's army. Both armies spent the rest of summer licking their wounds. Meade would advance again in September, but halted after he had to dispatch troops for the Chattanooga campaign. Lee took the opportunity to launch a turning move on Meade's right flank, but Meade proved too cagey for Lee's trap. Instead, the two fought a war of maneuver, while failing to bring each other to battle at an advantage. While Meade successfully pushed Lee behind the Rapidan, he was forced to retreat to winter quarters in December, following a failed river crossing to await the arrival of a new general-in-chief. This brings an end to the deadliest military engagement that ever took place on American soil. In our next episode on the American Civil War, we will part from the land war and take a brief interlude to discuss the naval theatre, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.